Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Income Gaming, Cheltenham's premier friendly local game store. Check the link in the description. Easy the height of the mightiest oak in the forest of Arden, the figure was clad in patchwork jerkin sewn from faded sailcloth. A barrel the size of an outhouse swung at its waist on a belt made from rigging ropes, and its bodily stench was like a plague house in a high summer. His bearded head was as large as the Queen's carriage, his features crude and grossly exaggerated. In that extract of Lords of the Lance by Graham McNeill, he describes today's painting tutorial subject. When he needed inspiration for the description of the giant in his story, he turned to the classic Marauder Giant from 1990. This full colour advert from White Dwarf 124 in 1990 shows off the Marauder Giant, along with some giant slayers sculpted by Ali Morrison. I remember poring over pictures of this giant in many White Dwarfs over the years as a teen. I always wanted one, but never got one, until an extremely generous channel viewer, Billy, sent me this metal one all the way from America. It's extremely heavy with really old lead that comes off in your hands, but he's absolutely fantastic, and I just had to make him into a painting tutorial. Welcome to Miniature Realms, my name's Stuart, and this is a painting tutorial for a classic Marauder Giant. I've prepared this miniature using an underpainting method, black prime first and then coming in from the top and the sides using an airbrush with white, and I'm just going back here and adding a bit of a dry brush as well to really pick out some of the detail. I've not gone all over here, but definitely over the areas with most texture like the hair and the beard, and then just to raise a couple of areas on the flatter surfaces where I really wanted the light to catch, and that will help me later on when I do thinner glaze layers. I won't do that all over the miniature, and when I don't, it just gives me a really nice outline for which to aim for. Miniature Realms is proudly sponsored by Baron of Dice, premium wargaming dice. Over 500 styles, over 4,000 customer reviews. Welcome to the best dice on the planet. I'm playing around with some new paints in this tutorial, and here I'm using a triad from the Two Thin Coats range, and it's Barbarian Brawn, Dwarven Skin and Elven Skin. Regular viewers of the channel will know that I quite like to use contrast style paints to do a lot of my base coating. I use them as glazes over this underpainted miniatures, but this is such a large model with large flat areas, the skin methods which wouldn't work very well here. I wanted to go back to a more traditional method, so here I'm using Barbarian Brawn at the darkest tone here and just applying a thin layer all over the skin areas on the giant. I'll say now that I really enjoyed using these paints. They're incredibly smooth, very silky, and they go on extremely well. You definitely don't need two coats as well in all cases. I was very careful here and made sure my coats were very thin, but using on a wet palette with a little bit of water added there, they were so easy and smooth to work with. I'll definitely recommend them if you haven't tried them already. The great thing about this range is it compares very closely with the Citadel range as well, so if you're looking to follow along at home, you could use Bugman's Glow, Cadian Flesh Tone and Kislev Flesh in place of these three colours. So with a triad like this, it's very easy to mix two colours together and get further layers in between, and what I'm doing here is applying a 50-50 mix of Barbarian Brawn and Dwarven Skin as my first highlight layer, and I'll just slowly build up throughout the colours. So after this I'll move on to pure Dwarven Skin and then onto a bit of a mix of Elven Skin and Dwarven Skin before finishing with finer highlights of Elven Skin at the top. This is probably the most lengthy process involved in painting the whole giant. In terms of surface area, this is the largest area in single colour, whereas the shirt and clothes and things, as you'll see later, are in smaller sections. The eye is going to be drawn to the skin on this miniature, so I wanted to make sure that it was fairly eye-catching, but it is also a gaming miniature. Now, it's a centerpiece or a character miniature, so it's not going to be basic tabletop standard, but it is still a form of tabletop. This is not going to win any awards in painting competitions. It's not going to be refined to those kind of levels. I found these paints layer very, very well, but they also really love to be wet blended, and that means mixing them together on the miniature while two colours are still wet essentially. Now that's a very short description of it, but I found it very, very easy to apply a paint and then go back with a lighter or a darker shade at the same time while the paint was still wet, blend them together with a brush, add a little bit of moisture sometimes by licking the brush or water from the pot, and it really, really smoothed it out nicely, and they were very, very easy to use and achieve a good result from them. At this stage I was making glazes using the darker tone, the Barbarian Brawn, mixing quite a lot of water in, almost 8 parts water to 2 parts paint, and then just glazing back over the areas of the miniature so I could soften any blends or any layers. And again, this worked really, really well. This paint didn't break down too much and really glazed nicely for anyone who was interested in those kind of techniques and interested in how it handles. That's my mini review within a tutorial for you. And before I highlighted the face, I went in and added the eyes. The reason he's lying down on his back here is because he's very, very heavy, and it was the easiest way I could sort of hold the miniature and reach the eyes and the teeth. And once those eyes were in, I was back to the same method but on the cheeks and the nose and highlighting that face. Now the reason I do the eyes beforehand is if I do make any mistakes, it's really easy to fix them with the flesh tones that you're painting the skin on, rather than if you perfect the skin and get a really nice finish and then you go to do an eye and you slip and the eye's too big one side, and then you've got to fix the paint on the skin as well. So I always go in before I do my highlight levels on the skin and do the eyes. Little tip there if you don't already do that. A few final touches to the skin, getting towards those top levels with the elven skin just along the tops of the cheekbones, and we are pretty much there. So we now move on to some Vallejo Express colour, gloomy violet and deep purple, and regular viewers of the channel will have recognised these from a method I use quite a lot with their own dwarf skin express colour. Now here I've not used the dwarf skin, I've used a more traditional method, but I'm still using the gloomy violet and the deep purple to add glazes for extra tone. The more purple tone I add into the sort of shaded areas, the dark areas, and the redder tone I blend out a little bit more, go around the elbow like you can see here. It just gives variation in the flesh tone, adds a little bit of warmth here and there, adds a little bit of depth and shadow. It really, really adds to the finish. Now I have added a little touch of water to these on the wet palette before I apply them to the miniature, and it's only the smallest amount of paint, and then with a clean brush I just feather them out and blend them out. As you can see here, it just really adds some redness and depth, especially around the boils and things on the face there, which will become useful later on in the tutorial, as you'll see. This is Contrast Achelian Green. It's a kind of bluish tinted green. I'm going to be using it in some of the sections on his tunic. Now this is all sewn together from different patches, so we'll be using a number of different colours. And now this, it will be very familiar to regular viewers of the channel, and this is why I like to use my underpainting method. So rather than just pure white prime or a pure black, this is why I do the underpainting method, why I do that bit of dry brushing sometimes as well. So this is kind of a la slap chop to a certain extent for those of you who have seen those kind of techniques mentioned, but they've been around for a long time. And what you're really doing here, while working from a base of underpainting, and you apply glaze layers over the top, or in this case a contrast paint, which is essentially a thick glaze, you get all of that highlighting that you can see on the miniature shows through these thinner paints. So you actually, it does a lot of the work for you. Now in this instance I will go on and I will highlight afterwards very traditionally, but this gives me an outline to work from and gives me a base layer and all the shadow in those recesses. Now we have another triad from Two Thin Coats, and this whole tutorial is not full of Two Thin Coats, but I really wanted to try out this triad as well. So we have Sentient Turquoise, Cursed Blue and Ray Gun Glow, and I picked these as a triad because I really liked the range of colours, and I picked the Achelian Green as the base colour because it matched that triad, and that's exactly what the kind of look I was going for. I could just start with the Sentient Turquoise if I want to and build up from there. That would work absolutely fine, but the deepest shadows of the Achelian Green will give me a little bit more shadow than that did. And what I'm doing here is starting with that Sentient Turquoise and basically building up where the higher areas are on the miniature, so the tops of the folds of the clothing, and that will be the same method through all of the different colours that I use on this miniature. And once that first layer is down, I'm on to the Cursed Blue, and again slightly thinner lines on those raised areas, and you start to build up some highlights there.
Then of course we get onto the ray gun glow, which is the top highlight, and much thinner lines yet again, and this is a very classic layering technique. Essentially we have 4 different layers if we class the contrast as well. We can also mix them together, which I do a little bit in times. This colour's on the back of the miniature as well, and I don't film absolutely every single part, but you can do quite a lot with these colours. They blend together well like they did on the skin, and you can also do a very sort of simple layering method like I'm doing here with thin neat lines. Now we're on to the next colour, and it's Nazdrag Yellow, also a Citadel contrast colour, and it's the perfect yellow base. It's really deep, rich and mustardy, and in the recesses it gives you an almost brown shadow, which is what you really want as a deep shadow for yellow. So again, I'm picking out certain areas on this multi-fabric tunic, including this sort of little shoulder ruff there, and then the highlight colours are Avalanche Sunset and Phalanx Yellow from Citadel Colour. And using exactly the same method as I did with the two thin coats triads, just 2 colours obviously in this time round, but you can mix them together if you want a mid-tone. I'm just gently building up the layers, picking those higher areas, thin the paint down quite a lot. The Citadel colour is much more viscous, and I really wanted to make sure that I had smooth lines here. But just working where that highlight is already showing, you get that from the thinner glazed Nazdrag Yellow over that underpainted miniature. So basically following along those lines to really help me here. And as I move on to that Phalanx Yellow, it's much thinner lines, trying to keep it as neat as possible, but still working on that layering method that I did with the blue, so those thin lines really start to make it pop. And I find that going over a line a couple of times will help increase the intensity rather than going too thick first time round and having it bleeding to areas that you don't want it to. And sticking with contrast for our base layers, this is Blood Angels Red, which is this beautiful, rich, vibrant red, and that will be perfect with the 2 previous colours and perfect for a number of the sections on the tunic of the Giant. And with that contrast base layer dry, I'm onto my own little mini triad that I made myself, and we have Mephiston Red, Evil Sun Scarlet and Wild Rider Red. And again, we're just building them up exactly the same way as we did the previous colours. Nice, thin, neat lines, working where the highlights are showing from the underpainting, and just slowly decreasing to slightly thinner lines each time, so you've got all of the layers showing, adding that depth and really making it pop. By the time we get onto the top layer of Wild Rider Red, which is almost orange in some senses, you can just really see how it just adds those final touches. You don't want too much of this, or it will really wash out the vibrancy of the red and make it all look more desaturated and orange. You've got to be careful here, and if you feel that top colour is a bit too bright, you can always mix it 50-50 with the Evil Sun Scarlet. I wanted to add some less vibrant colours, some more sort of whites and creams and things now, and Contrast Skeleton Horde was the perfect base for that as well. It's extremely subtle. At the same time, I picked out a couple of little areas of parchment. There's some on the barrel here for the Bugman's XXX, and there's a little bit I don't show in this clip of a bottle at the back, which also has a little bit of parchment. Now for some model colour from Vallejo, and we have some green ochre, some Iraqi sand and some white grey, and this is the little triad I've made here in order to build up the whiter layers. Now I'm going extremely thin with these. I've thinned these 50-50 with water, and I'm almost sketching on here. I don't want to go too bright and have too bold a colour, so again working from the tops and blending down. I'm just slowly building up the layers and then building up the contrast slowly, and in contrast I mean there in colour, not contrast paint. Something else I did quite a lot on the tunic was to edge the panels with the brightest colour. So it's not quite an edge highlight because they're not always the definitive edge, but it really helps make those panels pop and stand out from the next one. And especially when you've got the shadow built in the crevices of the joins, it really just helps accentuate that and make it stand out more. So these areas of cream white cover more than just a single sewn together panel on the Giant's tunic. So what I've done here is gone back in with the Skeleton Horde and just applied a glaze over the top in some sections. And what it does is add variation and a slightly different tone between panels. Now on to some contrast apothecary white, and this is just a really easy way of doing white. Now you do need a white base or very nearly white base to work from. This doesn't work if you've got black or grey or something like that. Essentially, this as a contrast paint is a shade. It works like a shade. It's a milky colour, and when it dries in the recesses you get this kind of grey tone. And then what you want to do afterwards is you either wipe it off the higher areas while it's still wet, leaving white on the top and the grey in the recesses, or you go back and highlight afterwards. And for those whites we're using model colour white grey and Pro Acryl bold titanium white, which is by far the best white I've ever used. Incredibly smooth and incredibly resilient to thinning or to blending, and just very, very striking, and goes on so smooth. So after the initial layer of the white grey, we're just going back with that bold titanium white and almost adding lines on the edges here, a bit like a thick edge highlight, working to a point in the middle as well, and you really get that nice transition between a grey colour and the top bright white. While the whites were out, I also touched up a couple of other areas. So half of this shield was white, so I used it to highlight at this stage, and for the other side I used Contrast Black Legion and just applied a thin layer over the other half of the shield, making sure that I didn't cover up the red emblem on the top. A very quick highlight of London Grey on that black, and that will be it done. So this is Contrast Garagax Sewer, one of my favourite brown contrast style paints out there. Fantastic for both wood and for leather. So here I'm using it on the wood of the Bugman's barrel. Now I will also use it on the big tree stump that he's waving as well, but I do this later on. This miniature is extremely heavy and really hard to paint, and I made a big mistake painting him on his base like this. I should have pinned him to a big chunk of wood, as my friend Dan had told me, and it would have been so much easier. He's so top heavy that it's very hard to hold the miniature without touching the paintwork, and I was using that tree stump to hold the miniature quite often, so I decided to leave it unpainted to a little bit later on, otherwise I feared I'd just wear all the paint and rub it all off. This is Army Painter Speed Paint 2.0 and hardened leather, and it's a beautiful orangey leather colour. It's a lovely formulation that runs into the recesses really well and leaves very smooth surfaces. You don't get that kind of tide mark pooling that you sometimes get, and contrast in many ways is probably the worst for that if you don't control it. The Army Painter Speed Paints are very good at running into the recesses. Sometimes you don't want that, but for this use it's absolutely fantastic. So working my way around this miniature, picking out all those little bits that are going to be leather, like the belt here on the sandals, and you'll see that the underpainting method that we did earlier is just helping loads here. It already looks like there's a funny white edge highlight, and when you apply this Army Painter Speed Paint over the top, you already get that highlight at the edges. It looks fantastic, saves you lots of time. I will do a little bit of edge highlighting on some of this, but if you didn't want to, you didn't have to. This is Gilly Green, also from Army Painter Speed Paint 2.0, and I decided to use it on the sort of pouches or little sacks that he's carrying, and it's such a lovely colour, works the same way, and I didn't highlight this later on. The finished effect you see here of the darker recesses and the lighter highlights based over that underpainted miniature is how I left it, and I think it works perfectly. Now I was going to do different colours for each of the pouches, but I didn't want to add too much different colour to this miniature. There's a lot already, and I figured that maybe he got one sheet of fabric and he's ripped it into these different pouches. At this stage there are lots of little fiddly bits, and this is a contrast dark Angel's Green. It's a very, very deep dark green, so I'm using it as bottle green. Now back to contrast, and it's Cygor brown. This is this beautiful rich reddish brown, a very warm colour, perfect for the giant's hair, beard and unibrow. Sticking with contrast, and we have some Agarash Tunes, which is a slightly yellower, richer version of Skeleton Horde, and this is perfect for the ropes, the massive ropes that the giant has probably stolen from some shipping somewhere, and this will cover all the ropes on the miniature. While that paint was out, I thought it was the perfect colour to add some slightly yellowing toenails and fingernails as well. I added it round the cuticle more, leaving a little bit of white towards the end of the nail, and then with a touch of water just blending it out where I needed. The same colour was absolutely perfect to add a slightly putrid, off-looking, pussy yellow stain to this bandage. I imagine what's underneath isn't very pleasant at all. Then it was time to start painting that massive wooden club that he's carrying, and I'm using the Garagak sewer, which I mentioned earlier, but I'm also mixing it in with some Gilly Dew, which we've also used before, which is a green colour. And then at the same time, I think there's a little bit of hardened leather in my palette as well. Now I'm wet blending on the miniature here, and it's a really nice way of adding some extra tonal variation, some extra interest to what is a large area that would all be one colour. And of course there will be some highlights afterwards and some texture added through some dry brushing and things like that, but just, this really helps him, in my opinion, add some extra kind of interest to it and some variation, and makes it look a little bit cool. We're now on to model colour light brown, and this is the perfect colour for highlighting that hardened leather. And if you don't have hardened leather and you use something like Cygor brown from the Citadel contrast range, it would work just as well for that as well. And just some thin edge highlights here, some little scratches and things, and you've got your perfect sort of light leather look. Staying with model colour, we have some saddle brown and some Germo camo pale brown here, and they are the perfect two highlights for that Cygor brown base, and you may well have seen that combination before in other videos. Now in this instance we're doing it just on the hair. I'm doing a bit of a dry brush or almost over brush here. Now this is obviously a traditionally sculpted miniature from 1990, so there's no CAD files going on here, so this hair was very much carved in with a thin instrument, so it's a lot easier to dry brush rather than painting the individual strands. Again, model colour and a little bit of tan earth, and that's a perfect top highlight for the Garagak sewer. Now, if you're doing a larger area, you might want to use a mid-tone in between, but I'm very lightly dry brushing here just to pick out a little bit of the detail. This is model colour deck tan, and it's a kind of off-white greyish kind of colour, but it seems to work very well as a light dry brush over dark wood areas, and you can find that it's a perfect layer to add now, and it does look a little bit white, but we're going to glaze back afterwards. So it's just really good at picking out a little bit of texture and a little bit of detail. I'm using it here on the fence and the axe handle that's on his base as well. For the rope areas, I'm using some Raki sand here. It's a kind of a pale off-white with more white than the yellow tones that you might find in something like a dark sand kind of colour, and it's just perfect again for highlighting the rope area. So I'm just going along and adding a little top highlight to each little section of rope. It's quite large on this miniature, so it doesn't take too long. Back to the trusty contrast skeleton horn, and because this is so thin, it's almost a glaze as it is anyway, and I'm going back in over where I dry brushed that deck tan, and it really just takes the white tone and the edge off a little bit and adds more variation to that wooden tree stump. And now we're on to those metallics, and it's decayed metal from Scale Colour, or Scale 75. This is a sort of a deep dark coppery bronze colour, and I like to base coat a lot of my metals with this, and I'm going to cover all areas of metal on the miniature, from the golden bands to the silver buckle straps, not forgetting the little frying pan on the back. For the gold, I'm going to be using some Necro Gold, also from Scale Colour, or Scale 75, and it goes directly over the decayed metal, leaving some of the decayed metal showing. It adds shadow into the recesses, so much so that you don't really need washes if you didn't want to, but you of course you can do, and I will be using some oil washes later on in this as well, but it works very nicely and gives you some shadow and keeps it nice and clean. And then for the top highlight on that, I'm going to be using some Elven Gold. Now that is a perfect kind of highlight on top of the Necro Gold, and just add it to a few areas to really make it pop. For the silver spectrum of the metals, I'm going to be using some black metal, again from Scale Colour, and that goes over the decayed metal as well. It's a perfect base for either sort of spectrum of metallic colours. It works really well, of course, on coppers and things as well. So just going over the belt buckle to start with, and then we got the bands on the barrel, and we've also got all the armour that you see on his gauntlets. So I'm guessing over the knuckles, well, they are actually knee armour of a Bretonnian knight or something like that, and some chainmail. But again, this is the colour I use to base colour, and I want to leave a lot of that decayed metal just peeping through, especially when I kind of overbrush or loosely dry brush over the chainmail on the hand. But you just leave a little bit of that brownish metal showing through, and it adds lots of nice depth. For the top highlight, I'm going to Game Air Silver, and again, if you watch my channel a lot, you'll have seen the combination of those three paints again and again. I just really like it. Works well for me, and I'll continue using it. Now, I'm being a little bit less heavy here with this. I'm a bit more of an edge highlight, or just picking out certain areas. So on the bands of the barrel, I really just focus where the light is hitting, and then wet my brush and just blend it out a little bit. I go a little bit heavier when it comes to the chainmail on the hand, but not an awful lot. I'm really just trying to highlight here and pick out some certain areas, but make sure I don't obliterate the previous two layers. So the pace picks up more as we reach the end of the miniature, and at this stage I want to use some oil washes, but I want to use them on the base as well. So I'm adding my base texture now because it needs to dry and set before I can do it. It's just a matter of popping this on last thing at night and letting it dry overnight. Now, if you haven't got time for that, and I quite often don't, blasting it with a hairdryer for a little while works very well, but just be careful if you've got plastic miniatures or resin miniatures because they can bend or misshape. With that all dry, I have grease, ready mixed oil wash from Soilworks, also a scale 75 or scale colour product. And now I'm just using this to add a bit of a pin wash here in certain areas on both colours of metal. Now, grease is quite a sepia colour, and I'm just adding a little bit here to the gold. It works very well. But it's also a dirty enough colour that I find it works very nicely on more silver metals as well. And I'm also here just adding a little bit of depth, little patches here or there, letting it run into all the recesses on that chainmail, a little bit into the recesses on the knuckle armour, we'll call it, but not too much because I don't want to take away any of that top shine. The joys of oil washes is you can wipe them away anyway, they don't pull the same way, and you can clean them off even when they look dry using a little bit of Artist White Spirit. But I'm dabbing it here on the base as well, rather than using something like an Agrax Surf Shade. It works perfectly, and it dries super matte and an almost muddy, dirty look when it finishes, which is great for bases. A little bit of light sienna Vallejo pigment brushed directly into the texture on the base. I blow off the excess and it just sits there. I don't bother sealing it, and leaves a nice sort of multi-tone dusty effect. Adding a few tufts here which match the theme of my armies. Now I'm actually using this miniature in my Bretonnian army as a unit filler in my Exiles list. I also hope that he will have rules to be used as a mercenary in games as well with my Bretonnians or future Empire. That'd be fun. This is some Vallejo thick mud, European mud effect. How many times do I want to say mud in a sentence? This stuff is great, just splotch it on here and there, and when it dries a little bit more translucent. On to the real final touches now. Blood for the Blood God, which is quite often the way. He actually has lots of cuts and scratches all over him. I think they need dealing with. I think if you just leave them empty, it would look a little bit strange. So I add a little bit of blood for the Blood God within the crease itself, and then just wetting my brush slightly, dragging it down from the edges as if the blood was running. And I'm also using a little bit in the mouth, as if maybe been munching on some raw meat or something like that. And it also works really well just to paint it around those boils and warts and spots and things, and it just makes them look a little bit moist and a little bit gross. I couldn't resist a little bit of blood splatter on some of the clothing, but I didn't want to go too heavy, and I do add some off camera to the end of his massive club as well. And then a little bit of yellow to the edge of some of the boils. This is Toothing Coat's Yellow Flame, but any bright yellow will do, just a little dot. And there we have it, all done. I had loads of fun painting this one. It's an absolute beast of a miniature, super hard to hold. That was the worst part of it. But anyway, onto some stills, because yeah, he is really heavy. Have I mentioned that already? Well, I hope you've enjoyed that. I had a absolute blast painting this miniature, and it gave me the opportunity to depart from some of my painting tutorials where I rely very heavily on base coating. Just in contrast, there's an awful lot of that obviously in this tutorial, but to show you how I painted skin in a more traditional method, which I've done on a few other videos, I definitely think that it kind of widens the scope of the tutorials on the channel. And like I mentioned at the beginning, this is very much a kind of a centerpiece character level, but also for an army. This isn't designed to be a competition winning piece. I do think the finish is pretty pleasing and pretty eye-catching, and I'm looking forward to having them in some games and in my armies, because I think that'll be loads of fun. But anyway, let me know what you think. Have you enjoyed the video? If you have, please consider subscribing to the channel. Give us a like, add a comment below. It really helps the video and the channel get seen by other people. The channel has a really friendly Discord that's growing. You can talk about any game under the sun. There's lots of old world chatter in there, but it's incredibly friendly and relaxed. And where I can do, I jump in and offer help with painting and answer questions and those kind of things as well. I do have a Patreon for those of you who'd like to support the channel even further. There are 5 tiers currently on there. The most basic is just £1 or $1, and it's very much a thank you and supporting the channel, and they grow up through the tiers, and right to the top tiers actually have online painting tuitions if you'd like to sit and have me teach you how to do things like this online, in person but online. Then I'm very happy to help you, and just check the link in the video description if that's something that interests you. But on that note, it's time to say goodbye. Thank you to all my existing patrons and supporters. I really do appreciate all your help and support. And take care, and I'll catch you soon.